The rain hammered against the windows, a relentless rhythm that echoed through the empty apartment. Lucy sat at her desk, her laptop screen illuminating her tired face. She'd been working late again, the project deadline fast approaching. But tonight, something felt off. The air in her small, third-floor apartment seemed thicker, heavier, as though it carried with it a weight of unease that she couldn't shake. Every little sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards, felt amplified, as though the walls were closing in on her. It had started a week ago. At first it was subtle, little things that didn't make sense. A shadow darting past her window when no one was there. A fleeting glimpse of movement out of the corner of her eye. She brushed it off as stress from work, or her imagination playing tricks on her. But then, the knocks began. At first, it was one knock, firm, deliberate, at the front door. It was always late at night, after she had finished her work and was just about to head to bed. When she opened the door, no one was there. Just the empty hallway, the flickering light bulb above the door, casting eerie shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. She told herself it was probably the wind or a neighbor trying to get her attention. But the knocking continued, growing more persistent. "Who's there?" she called out one night, her voice trembling slightly. No answer. Lucy stood in the doorway, her pulse pounding in her ears, staring at the empty hallway. It felt as though the very air around her was holding its breath, waiting. She stood there for a long moment before closing the door, a sense of unease settling deep in her gut. But that night, as she lay in bed trying to drift into sleep, she heard it again. Another knock, softer this time, coming from the window. Frozen in fear, Lucy lay still, barely breathing. She could hear it now. Faint taps against the glass, slow and steady, as though someone was waiting for her to respond. She didn't move. She didn't dare. She couldn't explain the sensation that crawled up her spine, the growing sense that someone, something, was watching her. The next morning, Lucy went about her day, trying to push the strange occurrences to the back of her mind. But the knocking didn't stop. It continued each night, as though it was always there, waiting for her, persistent and unnerving. Each time she answered the door or checked the window, she found nothing but the same empty hallway or street outside. The loneliness of her apartment seemed to deepen, the silence pressing in on her, suffocating her. She tried to ignore it, but then the notes started. At first, it was a single scrap of paper left under the door. Just a few words, scrawled hastily in ink. "I'm watching you." The message sent a chill through her, the handwriting jagged and unfamiliar. She checked her locks, bolted the door, and shut the windows. But the fear gnawed at her. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her every move. It didn't end there. The next day, Lucy came home to find another note. This one was more specific. "I know when you're alone." Her stomach twisted into knots as she stood in the hallway, staring at the note in her trembling hands. Her thoughts raced. How did they know? How had they gotten inside? She had never seen anyone in the hallway, never heard footsteps, nothing. But now, the apartment, which once felt like a sanctuary, felt like a trap. The next knock came that evening, just as she was finishing dinner. The sound was louder this time, more insistent, as if whoever was on the other side of the door was growing impatient. Lucy didn't answer. Instead, she crouched behind the couch, holding her breath, hoping that if she stayed silent enough, whoever it was would leave. The knocking continued for hours, each tap like a drumbeat against her nerves, driving her closer to the edge of hysteria. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. Lucy waited for a long time before cautiously standing up. The room was silent again, too silent, as though the world outside had stopped turning. She peeked through the peephole, expecting to see nothing. But to her horror, there, on the other side of the door, was a figure. A shadowed silhouette, tall and thin, standing completely still. Lucy's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the silhouette through the peephole. Her hand shook as she reached for the door handle, terrified of what she might find, but knowing she couldn't stand there forever. She was alone in the apartment, and she couldn't just ignore it any longer. The figure stood motionless, unnervingly still, just outside the door. No sound, no movement, only that chilling presence pressing against the other side. She hesitated, her breath shallow and uneven, before slowly stepping back from the door. Her mind screamed at her to leave, to run. But there was nowhere to run to. She was trapped in the apartment, a prisoner of her own fear. The knocking had stopped, but now she was even more terrified. She pressed her ear against the door, listening for any sign that the person, or whatever it was still there. But the silence hung thick, heavy, like a fog that threatened to suffocate her. She gathered what little courage she had left and tiptoed toward the window. She pulled back the curtain just enough to peer outside. The streetlights flickered in the distance, casting long, eerie shadows along the empty sidewalk. There was no sign of anyone. No one was watching her from the street, and yet, that nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach wouldn't go away. Whoever, or whatever, was behind that door wasn't just someone passing through. It was waiting for her, hunting her. With her heart in her throat, she turned away from the window and stood motionless in the center of the room, listening for any sound that might break the oppressive silence. The clock on the wall ticked louder than she had ever noticed before, each second stretching endlessly. She tried to remind herself that it was just someone playing a prank, or perhaps a mistake, a misunderstanding. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. This had been building up for days, and now it had escalated to something darker, something more sinister. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, snapping her out of her thoughts. Lucy froze for a moment, staring at it like it was a lifeline. She reached for it, hoping it was a text from a friend, someone, anyone who could give her some semblance of comfort. The screen lit up, but the message was from an unknown number. "I can see you through the window." Her blood ran cold, the words sinking into her like a dagger. Her hands trembled as she read the message again, each word more chilling than the last. She glanced quickly at the window, her eyes darting across the street, but saw nothing. No one. There was no sign of movement outside, no hint that anyone had been watching her. Yet, the message was clear. Whoever was behind this had been watching her for days, maybe longer. They knew where she was, they knew her every move. She wasn't safe. A sudden loud bang on the door made her jump. Her heart nearly stopped. She could feel it now. Whatever was on the other side of the door wasn't just waiting, it was coming for her. She ran to the door, panic rising in her chest, and slammed her hand against the deadbolt, securing it with a frantic urgency. The knocking didn't stop, though. It was louder now, more insistent, like someone was trying to break down the door. Her whole body trembled, and her mind raced to find a way out. She had to leave. She couldn't stay here anymore. As she backed away from the door, she heard a voice. Soft, almost a whisper, but clear as day. The voice was low and grating, like it had been dragged across 1,000 miles of dust. It sent chills down her spine. "You're not leaving, Lucy, not until I'm done." The words sent a shudder through her, a wave of terror that swept over her in an instant. She could feel the darkness closing in around her, pressing in from every direction. She glanced at the windows again, but there was nothing. No one, just the empty, dark street. Yet the voice lingered in her mind, each word a reminder that she was trapped, alone, helpless, and completely at the mercy of whatever or whoever was tormenting her. Her eyes darted to the closet in the corner of the room. Without thinking, she grabbed the nearest object she could find, her phone, and began dialing for help. Her fingers fumbled over the keys as her mind raced for a plan, for something that would allow her to escape. But when she pressed the call button, all she heard was the same unsettling silence. No ringing, no connection. It was as if the phone had been cut off from the outside world. A sharp, guttural sound came from the other side of the door, followed by another loud bang. The door shuddered, the wood creaking under the pressure. Lucy's breath hitched. Whatever was on the other side wasn't going to stop. It was coming through, and she had nowhere to go. The door splintered with another deafening bang, the wood groaning as if it were alive and in pain. Lucy stumbled backward, her heart racing, her mind filled with a whirlwind of panic and dread. The knocking had stopped, but the damage had already been done. The door was beginning to give way, cracking under the pressure of whatever force was on the other side. She tried to think, to find a way to escape, but her thoughts were scattered, her body frozen in fear. With a desperate glance toward the window, she saw nothing. No movement, no shadows. But the silence that hung in the air felt suffocating, like the calm before the storm. It was as if the world outside her apartment had gone still, just as the figure outside her door had gone still. It was waiting for her to make the wrong move. The phone in her hand buzzed again, this time with an incoming call. It was the unknown number. Her stomach churned, but she answered it, holding the phone up to her ear, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Hello," she said, her voice trembling. "Who is this?" A long pause followed, and then the voice came. It was raspy, almost like a growl, but unmistakably human. "You can't escape, Lucy. I'm already inside." The words hit her like a slap to the face. Her blood turned to ice as she realized what they meant. Whoever was tormenting her had already found a way in, already breached the walls of her apartment. She was not alone. And the worst part was that they knew her name. They knew everything about her. The call ended abruptly, the silence ringing in her ears. She stood there, paralyzed, staring at the phone in her hand as if it were a foreign object, something she didn't recognize. She had to move. She couldn't just stand there. But her legs felt like lead, her entire body weighed down by a sense of impending doom that made it impossible to think clearly. The door groaned again, and this time the crack in the wood widened. She could see the faint outline of the person, tall, thin, and impossibly still on the other side. There was something about them that made her feel as though they didn't belong in this world, as though they were something darker, something out of place. The way they stood, unmoving, their shadows stretching unnaturally across the floor. It was as if they were a part of the dark itself, a thing that didn't belong in the light. She turned away from the door, her hands trembling as she tried to think of an escape. The apartment was small, cramped. No balcony, no back door. She was trapped. Her mind raced, memories flashing of the times she had lived here, of the peaceful nights spent alone. She couldn't fathom how things had gone so wrong, how the house she had called home had turned into a prison. Then, a new sound, something soft, barely audible, but unmistakable, came from the kitchen. It was a scraping noise, like something dragging across the floor. Lucy's eyes snapped toward the hallway that led to the kitchen. She held her breath, straining to hear. The scraping stopped for a moment, only to start again, this time louder, closer. Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't imagining it. Something, or someone, was in the kitchen, and it was coming closer. With a final burst of adrenaline, Lucy bolted from the living room, her mind focused solely on escape. She had to get out of there. She didn't know how, but she had to. The hallway felt longer than it ever had before, the darkness closing in around her as if the very walls were shifting, moving. The scraping grew louder, closer, and then, there it was. A figure standing at the kitchen doorway, blocking her path. The figure was tall, impossibly thin, and dressed in black. Its face was hidden in shadow, but Lucy could see the gleam of its eyes, reflecting the dim light from the hallway. There was something so unnatural about the way it stood, like it was waiting for her to make the wrong move. Lucy stopped dead in her tracks, her breath caught in her throat. She had nowhere to go. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, as though it were waiting for her to make a choice. Every instinct in her screamed at her to run, to push past it, but she knew there was no way out, no escape. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, her voice shaking with terror. The figure didn't respond. It only stared, its cold eyes locking with hers. And in that moment, Lucy realized this wasn't just about her. This was something much bigger, something older. The figure wasn't just here for her. It was here to take her. She reached for the knife block on the kitchen counter, her hands trembling as she grabbed the nearest knife, its cold steel a fleeting comfort. But before she could take a step forward, the figure moved. It was swift, impossibly fast, and before she could even react, it was right in front of her. "Leave me alone!" Lucy screamed, her voice cracking. The figure didn't flinch. It simply raised a hand, long, bony fingers that seemed to stretch unnaturally, and touched her arm. The touch was colder than anything Lucy had ever experienced. It wasn't just physical cold, it was a deep, penetrating chill, like it came from somewhere far beyond the mortal realm, somewhere dark and forgotten. Her skin burned where the figure's fingers brushed against her arm, the sensation crawling deeper into her bones. She tried to pull away, but it was as if the hand was a part of her, the grip tightening with an unnatural force. "Let go," Lucy gasped, struggling with all her strength to break free. But the figure didn't respond, its grip unwavering, its eyes fixed on hers. It didn't speak, but somehow she could feel its presence seeping into her thoughts, into her very soul. It was as if it knew everything about her, every secret, every fear. And it was using that knowledge to tighten its grip on her, to drag her further into the darkness. The knife in her hand felt useless, a weight that offered no comfort. She raised it shakily, ready to defend herself, but before she could strike, the figure moved again, faster than her eyes could follow. The blade flew from her hand, spinning across the room to the floor with a clatter that echoed through the silence. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she backed into the kitchen counter, her legs trembling, her mind spiraling into panic. She tried to scream, but her throat closed up, the words trapped inside her, swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to swallow her whole. And then, in a voice that was not its own, the figure spoke. "You are mine now, Lucy," it whispered. The voice was hollow, devoid of emotion, yet somehow familiar. It was like hearing the voice of someone she knew, but distorted, twisted, like a nightmare wearing the face of a loved one. It chilled her to the core. "No," Lucy cried, shaking her head, trying to distance herself from the suffocating presence. She couldn't understand how it had come to this, how her life had devolved into a nightmare. This was her home, her safe space. How could it be so easily overrun by something so dark, so wrong? The figure's eyes gleamed, like twin black voids that seemed to swallow all the light in the room. She could feel its gaze crawling over her skin, digging into her thoughts, pulling at the deepest parts of her mind. It wasn't just physically close to her now. It was inside her head, inside her heart. It was everywhere. "You can't fight me," it said again, its voice a low rasp that sent shivers down her spine. "You already belong to me." Lucy felt herself weaken, the terror consuming her. The room began to distort, the walls stretching out of shape, the shadows growing longer, darker. She couldn't breathe. Her chest constricted, as if the weight of the house itself was pressing down on her, suffocating her. Tears streamed down her face, but she refused to give in. She fought for clarity, for something, anything that would break the hold the figure had on her. And then, in a flash of desperation, a thought struck her. The front door. She hadn't locked it yet. The figure's grip faltered for a split second, just enough for Lucy to make her move. She bolted toward the door, her legs moving before her mind could catch up. The figure hissed, its shadow rising to follow her, but it was too late. Lucy slammed into the door, throwing the deadbolt and wrenching it open with a force she didn't know she had. For a moment, the world outside the door felt like a dream. The rain had stopped. The street was quiet, almost too quiet, as if waiting to see what would happen next. She hesitated for only a second, her body still trembling with fear, before she ran out into the night. The streetlights flickered as she ran, her footsteps echoing on the wet pavement. She could still feel the presence of the figure behind her, could still sense its eyes burning into her back. But she refused to look back. She couldn't stop running. Not now. Not ever. She didn't know how far she ran. She didn't know how long it had been. But eventually, she found herself in a small park, standing on the edge of the empty swings, gasping for breath. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the exhaustion was setting in. But still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, watching her. Her phone buzzed again, and she pulled it from her pocket with trembling hands. The unknown number flashed on the screen. She stared at it for a moment, her heart in her throat. But this time, she didn't answer. Instead, she glanced around the dark park, her eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. She wasn't alone, she realized. But it wasn't just the figure. It was the whole night, the world around her, that had changed. It wasn't safe anymore. Her home wasn't safe. Her life wasn't safe. And then the phone rang again, louder this time. Lucy felt her blood run cold as she looked down at the screen. "I'm still here." The house at the end of Maple Street had always been quiet. Sarah, a young woman in her late 20s, had moved into the old two-story home just a month ago, eager to start over. After a difficult breakup and a string of dead-end jobs, she was hoping this small, remote town would offer the peace and stability she craved. The house was perfect, isolated, with a large garden and plenty of space for her to think and heal. Yet, something about it unsettled her, an unease she couldn't shake. It began the first night she spent alone. Sarah had unpacked most of her belongings and had just settled in when she heard a soft knock at the front door. It was late, nearly midnight, and she hadn't been expecting anyone. Hesitant but curious, she stood at the door and peered through the peephole. No one was there. The porch light flickered faintly, casting eerie shadows on the empty steps. Thinking it was some kids playing a prank, she locked the door and went to bed. But the feeling of being watched lingered. In the following days, the knocking grew more persistent. It wasn't always at the same time, but it was always at night, usually around midnight. Soft taps at first, then louder, harder, as if someone were trying to get in. One evening, Sarah decided to confront the noise. She waited, watching the clock strike midnight, then crept to the door. There was no one, only the emptiness of the dark porch. Her heart pounded in her chest, but there was nothing she could do. No one was there. She couldn't explain it, but somehow, she felt trapped. Weeks passed, and the knocks continued. There was no logical explanation for them. She lived in a small, quiet town. Neighbors were few, and everyone kept to themselves. But the isolation, which Sarah had once craved, began to feel suffocating. The house, which had been her sanctuary, now felt like a prison. Every night, the knocking would come, and each time, it was accompanied by a growing sense of dread. Sarah could no longer ignore it. The silence of the house had become a heavy, oppressive presence. It felt as though something or someone was waiting for her to acknowledge it. One night, after the knocks came again, Sarah decided to call the police. She couldn't take it anymore. She needed to know who or what was outside her door. The officer who answered her call was kind but skeptical. "Ma'am, we've had no reports of any disturbances in your area. It's probably just kids messing around," he said. "Just keep your doors locked and don't answer the door if you're not expecting anyone." It was the same response she always got. People didn't believe her. She wasn't sure what she was hoping for. Maybe someone to finally take her seriously. Maybe someone to explain the unease that had taken root in her bones. But that night, Sarah lay in bed wide awake, listening to the wind whistling outside and the trees scraping against her window. That's when she heard it. A voice, a low whisper, so faint she almost thought it was her imagination. "Let me in." Her blood ran cold. Sarah scrambled out of bed, heart racing. She ran to the window and threw the curtains open. There was nothing, just the dark, empty yard, bathed in the pale light of the moon. The whisper had seemed so real, though. Too real. And there was something about it that felt familiar, as if it were a voice she had heard before. She stood there for a moment, breathless, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. "Just my mind playing tricks on me," she muttered, trying to calm herself. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just her imagination. There was something more, something she couldn't explain. The following night, Sarah tried to put everything out of her mind. She told herself it was just the stress of moving, the anxiety of starting fresh in a new town. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that she was being watched. Every time she walked into a room, the sensation grew stronger, as if invisible eyes were tracking her every move. It was always the same feeling, cold, suffocating, like something was waiting for her to slip up. As the days passed, Sarah noticed odd things happening around the house. Items would be out of place, keys missing from the kitchen counter, a chair slightly turned in the dining room, a lamp that would flicker and then die when she walked by. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, just her own forgetfulness or the quirks of an old house. But when her toothbrush disappeared from the bathroom, replaced by a strange, unfamiliar one, she couldn't dismiss it anymore. The knocks, too, had become more insistent. No longer just at midnight, they came at all hours of the night, some gentle, others violent. Every time she heard them, her heart would skip a beat. She was afraid to leave her house after dark, afraid to go to bed, afraid to let her guard down for even a second. It was as if whoever, whatever, was out there, knew exactly when she was vulnerable. One evening, Sarah gathered the courage to call the police again. This time, she was determined to make them understand. She could no longer pretend everything was fine. But when the officer arrived, he didn't seem alarmed. "Ma'am, I've been by here a few times," he said, scanning the perimeter of her house. "It's a quiet neighborhood. Are you sure you're not just hearing things? Old houses do tend to creak, especially when it's windy." Frustration bubbled inside Sarah. She knew what she was hearing wasn't the wind, but there was no use in arguing. She thanked the officer, who left with a half-hearted promise to patrol the area more frequently. But as soon as the patrol car pulled away, the unease returned, settling into her bones like a permanent ache. That night, Sarah sat in the living room, staring at the front door. She had no intentions of opening it, but she needed to know. The knocking had become so persistent, so relentless, that she couldn't stand it any longer. With a trembling hand, she reached for the curtain and peeked through the window. Nothing. The porch was empty. The streetlights bathed the house in their dim glow, but there was no sign of movement. For a moment, Sarah allowed herself to breathe, to believe that perhaps it was all in her head. But then she noticed something strange. The window across from hers, just barely within view, had been left open, the curtains swaying in the night breeze. Her heart skipped. That window wasn't open before. She had made sure of it. She had double-checked all the windows earlier in the evening. But there it was, wide open, as if someone had been inside. Panic set in. She stood frozen, staring at the window, unsure of what to do. And then the voice came again. "Let me in." This time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was a full sentence, spoken in a voice she recognized, a voice she never wanted to hear again. It was Alex, her ex. The man who had once claimed to love her, the man who had become obsessed with her after their breakup, showing up at her house uninvited, calling her late at night, sending her endless texts. He had stalked her, driving her to the edge of sanity before she had finally fled, moving to this remote town to escape him. But now, his voice echoed in the darkness. "I'm here. You can't run from me." Her blood ran cold. The walls of the house seemed to close in around her as the terror set in. She backed away from the window, stumbling over the couch, her breath shallow. Alex was here. Somehow he had found her again. In that moment, Sarah knew the truth. The knocks, the whispers, the strange occurrences, they weren't just the products of her imagination. Alex had followed her. He had been watching her all along. And now, he was inside her house. The realization hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. Her hands trembled as she fumbled for her phone, dialing 911 in a panic. But her fingers were slick with sweat, and the number seemed to take forever to dial. She finally pressed the call button, but there was no connection, no ringing, just a dead silence. The battery had died. In that moment, the world felt like it was closing in on her. Her isolation, which she had once welcomed, now felt like a prison. With shaky legs, Sarah moved toward the kitchen. She had to do something. She had to get out of there. Her heart pounded in her ears as she grabbed the nearest object, a kitchen knife, and clutched it in her hand. It was pathetic, really. A knife wouldn't protect her from someone like Alex. But she had to try. She couldn't let him get close, couldn't let him win. He had taken so much from her already, her sense of safety, her peace of mind. She wasn't going to let him take her life. As she crept back into the living room, every shadow in the house seemed to mock her. The darkness stretched out in all directions, swallowing her whole. Her breath came in short gasps, and she wiped tears from her eyes, trying to steady herself. She knew she couldn't hide forever. She couldn't keep running. Alex would find her again, just like he always had. He had a way of making himself known, of insinuating himself into her life, whether she wanted it or not. Then, the doorbell rang. It wasn't the knock she had grown accustomed to, the soft tapping, or the violent rapping that made her blood run cold. This was different. This was deliberate, insistent. The doorbell echoed through the house, and Sarah froze. She stood there in the dim light, clutching the knife, her body rigid with fear. "Sarah," came a whisper from the other side of the door. It was Alex. His voice was low, smooth, like he was coaxing her. His presence, his manipulation, had always been like this, calm, insidious, like a slow poison that seeped into her mind. He had always been charming, sweet even, until he wasn't. until he became obsessed, until his love turned to control and his attention became a suffocating force. "I know you're in there," he continued, his voice just loud enough to be heard. "You can't hide from me, Sarah. You never could." The door handle rattled and Sarah's heart skipped. She rushed to the window and peered through the curtains, but she couldn't see him. There was nothing, no sign of him at all. But the voice, his voice was so real, so close. Her mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. She needed to get out, but how? She couldn't go out the front door. He would be waiting. She couldn't go through the back. That was where she had seen the window open, where she had last seen evidence of him being inside. There was no way out. She was trapped. "Let me in," Alex whispered again. But this time it wasn't through the door. It was in her head. His voice inside her mind, like a disease, worming its way into her thoughts. It felt so real, as if he were standing beside her, his breath on her neck. Sarah collapsed to her knees, clutching her head in her hands. She couldn't escape him. She couldn't escape the terror that had been following her for so long. Her entire life felt like it had been consumed by his obsession. She had tried to move on, tried to start over, but the past always caught up with her. She couldn't outrun it. And now, she couldn't outrun him. Then, the silence broke. The front door swung open. Her breath caught in her throat as her eyes snapped to the doorway. It was ajar, the light from the outside spilling into the room, but there was no sound, no footsteps, just the empty, oppressive quiet. She stood up slowly, inching toward the door, the knife still gripped tightly in her hand. Her head spun, and she felt dizzy from the terror, from the overwhelming sense that she was about to face something worse than she had ever imagined. She wasn't sure if she could survive this. She wasn't sure if she wanted to. But there was no turning back. If she didn't face him now, if she didn't take control, she might never have another chance. Sarah stepped forward, the darkness swallowing her, as she crossed the threshold of the door. The cold night air hit Sarah like a slap to the face as she stepped through the door. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her heart hammering in her chest. She stood on the porch, staring into the night. The house was still and silent, but her senses were on high alert. Every rustling leaf, every shift of the wind felt like a warning. The world outside was so quiet it was almost suffocating, and Sarah had the unsettling feeling that something was waiting, lurking just out of sight. She glanced back over her shoulder at the open door. Was Alex inside? Had he followed her out? No. The door was still ajar, but there was no sign of movement, no footsteps, no shadowy figure. Yet, the sensation of being watched never left her. She felt his presence lingering like a ghost tethered to her, waiting for her to slip up, to make a mistake. Taking a deep breath, Sarah stepped off the porch and into the yard. Her mind was spinning. She needed to get help. She needed to make sure she wasn't alone. But every direction she looked in seemed empty. The streetlights barely illuminated the path in front of her, and the houses on either side were dark and silent. There was no one around, no one who could help. The unease settled into her bones, making every step feel like an impossible chore. It was then that she heard it, the faint sound of footsteps crunching in the gravel behind her. She stopped in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. The footsteps were soft, deliberate, but unmistakable. She wasn't alone. Sarah spun around, her pulse racing. The yard was empty, the darkness stretching out in all directions. There was no one there. No one. She was starting to lose it, her mind playing tricks on her. But then the voice came again, louder this time, cold and clear. "I'm right behind you." The word sent a chill racing down her spine. She turned slowly, half expecting to see Alex standing just behind her, his twisted smile stretching across his face. But the yard remained empty. There was nothing but the darkness and the shadows, and yet, she knew. It was him. He was here, somewhere, watching, waiting. Her heart hammered in her chest as panic surged through her. She had to run. She had to get away before he could catch her, before he could take her. But where could she go? The town was small, and the roads were empty. She couldn't outrun him, not with the head start he had. The fear clawed at her insides, growing with every second. And then, she heard it. The sound of laughter. It was low, cruel, and it echoed through the night like a mocking whisper. It came from every direction, from the trees, from the very air itself. And for a split second, Sarah thought she might lose her mind. The laughter twisted in her ears, growing louder, more twisted. It was Alex's voice, but it was distorted, as if something was feeding on it, warping it into something darker. "Sarah," the voice whispered, this time directly in her ear. She spun around again, her breath coming in ragged sobs. But there was nothing. Nothing but the oppressive silence that threatened to swallow her whole. And then the ground shifted beneath her. The earth seemed to tremble, and the world spun. She fell to her knees, her vision blurring as the sounds of laughter faded into the distance. Something in her gut told her that this was the moment, this was the point of no return. She had been running for so long, but now it was too late. The house, the yard, the darkness, it all felt like a trap. Suddenly Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, trembling, but the screen was cracked, displaying only a cryptic message. "I'm always with you." Her heart stopped. The words were chillingly familiar, but it wasn't just the message that terrified her. It was the timestamp. It had been sent 5 minutes ago, before she had even stepped outside, before she had heard the footsteps, before she had heard the laughter. She wasn't alone. Alex wasn't just in her house. He was in her mind. He had always been there, stalking her, twisting her thoughts, creeping into the corners of her consciousness. The realization hit her with a force she couldn't understand. This wasn't about a person anymore. It wasn't about the house or the neighborhood. It was about something darker. Something she couldn't escape. As the laughter returned, louder than ever, Sarah collapsed to the ground, her body trembling with terror. She had thought she could outrun him, but she was wrong. Alex had already won. He had been with her all along, and as the darkness closed in, she understood the horrifying truth. There was no escape from the madness. It started as a whisper, a quiet rustling of papers, and a fleeting glance through the window. Emma Thompson, a quiet, introverted woman in her late 20s, had always enjoyed the solitude of her apartment on the outskirts of town. The apartment complex was old but well-maintained, tucked between tall oak trees that kept the streetlights from spilling too much into the shadows. Emma had moved there 6 months ago, eager for a fresh start after a bad breakup. The first few weeks had been peaceful, perhaps too peaceful. It was on a stormy Wednesday evening when Emma first noticed the presence. The rain pattered gently on the windows, a soothing sound that should have comforted her, but instead it stirred a feeling of unease. She sat in her living room, legs crossed on the couch, reading a book, when she heard it, a soft tap against the window. At first, she thought it was a branch, but as the sound repeated, a chill crawled up her spine. She stood and peered out through the heavy rain, her heart racing in her chest. Nothing, just the blur of the downpour and the distant lights of cars passing by. Maybe it was just the wind, but the nagging feeling remained. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. The days that followed were uneventful, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling. She caught glimpses of shadows from the corner of her eye, flashes of movement outside her apartment. It could have been her imagination. After all, she was alone. The isolation was something she had come to crave, but it also made her feel vulnerable. Each night, she would double-check the locks on her windows and doors before going to bed. She told herself it was just the overactive imagination of a woman too accustomed to silence. Then, one night, as she was returning home from her late shift at the bookstore, she noticed something strange. The door to her building was slightly ajar. The building was always locked, and Emma was the last one to leave. Her stomach twisted as she pushed the door open cautiously. The hallway lights flickered overhead as she walked down the corridor to her apartment. Her heart beat faster with each step, the air thick with an unease she couldn't explain. When she reached her apartment door, Emma froze. There, on the doormat, was a note. The handwriting was neat, but the words were unsettling. "I see you." Her breath hitched in her throat. A cold sweat broke out on her skin, and for a moment she couldn't move. Her mind raced. Who could have done this? Who had been watching her? She quickly grabbed the note, slipping it into her bag, and hurried inside, locking the door behind her. Her thoughts were a whirlpool of fear and confusion. She was certain she had checked the locks. Hadn't she? The thought of someone entering her home without her knowing sent waves of panic through her. That night, sleep eluded her. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind outside, sent her nerves into overdrive. Her eyes darted to the window, where the storm raged outside. The rain now seemed more sinister, the flashes of lightning casting eerie shadows across the room. At one point, Emma thought she saw a figure moving past the window, a dark silhouette barely visible in the dim light. She rushed to the window but found no one there. By the next morning, Emma convinced herself that it was all just paranoia. Perhaps the note was a prank, a cruel joke from one of her neighbors. She tried to shake off the feeling, to go on with her day as normal. But something was wrong. The air was thick with tension. It wasn't just the strange note or the unnerving feeling of being watched. It was the overwhelming sense of isolation that clawed at her. Every corner of her apartment now felt like it was hiding something. She began to notice small things, items that were slightly out of place, the faint sound of footsteps outside her door, a light that flickered in the hallway at odd hours. Nothing she could prove, nothing she could point to. But she was certain she wasn't alone. The next few days felt like a blur to Emma. The unease was now a constant companion, a gnawing feeling in the pit of her stomach that refused to let go. Every time she entered her apartment, it felt as though someone had been there before her. The thought made her skin crawl. She tried to ignore it, telling herself that it was just the overactive imagination of a woman alone in an empty apartment. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. It started getting worse. Each night, she heard the faint sound of footsteps outside her door, slow, deliberate steps, as if someone was walking around, waiting. Sometimes she'd hear them stop just outside her apartment, a cold silence filling the space before they resumed again. She would check the peephole, but no one would be there. Nothing. Just the sound of her own rapid heartbeat pounding in her ears. One evening, as Emma was sitting on the couch, her book abandoned beside her, she heard the unmistakable sound of a key turning in her front door. Her breath caught in her throat as she froze, staring at the door. She hadn't given anyone a key to her apartment. Her neighbors were quiet. None of them had ever come by unexpectedly. The key turned again, more urgently this time, but the door didn't open. The air felt thick, like the atmosphere had changed, like something had crossed a line. Emma jumped to her feet, her mind racing. She rushed to the door, pressing her ear to it. No sound, no movement. She quickly checked the locks. Everything was secure. Her hands were shaking as she backed away from the door. Who was out there? And why hadn't they just entered? Had they been watching her? The thought sent a fresh wave of dread crashing over her. She needed to leave. She couldn't stay here anymore. The creeping fear had grown too powerful to ignore. But as she grabbed her bag and hurried toward the door, she paused. Something caught her eye, a dark shape in the reflection of the mirror by the hallway. Her pulse spiked. She whirled around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty reflection of her hallway, bathed in dim light. The mirror, the damn mirror. For the first time, Emma felt that familiar sense of being watched surge through her. Not just from outside, but from the very walls of her apartment. She shook her head, trying to force the irrational thought away. But deep down, something told her she wasn't just imagining it anymore. This wasn't paranoia. Someone was out there. Someone was watching her, and she was powerless to stop it. The next morning, after another sleepless night, Emma returned to work, hoping that getting out of the apartment would clear her head. But the unease followed her like a shadow, the lingering sensation that something or someone was always just behind her. At the bookstore, her co-workers noticed the change. She had always been a quiet person, but now she was withdrawn, eyes darting to the door every time it opened, flinching at every noise. "Emma, you okay?" Sarah, one of her colleagues, asked as she walked by the counter. "You look a little off today." "I'm fine," Emma said, forcing a smile. "Just tired. Didn't sleep much." But Sarah didn't seem convinced. "You sure? You've been really jumpy lately. Like, you're expecting something." Emma opened her mouth to reply, but she was interrupted by a loud crash from the back room. Both women turned toward the sound, and Emma felt her stomach drop. Someone was in the store. Someone who shouldn't be. Her heart raced as she moved toward the back. But when she entered, the room was empty. save for a broken shelf and some scattered books. She breathed a sigh of relief, but the sensation of being watched gnawed at her once more. That night, Emma returned to her apartment, still shaken by the events at the bookstore. She hadn't told anyone about the feeling of being followed, about the strange note and the unsettling occurrences. But now, she wasn't sure if she could keep ignoring it. As she entered her apartment, she immediately felt the cold air settle around her. The apartment, which had always felt like her sanctuary, now felt like a cage. She locked the door behind her and moved to the window, peering out into the dark street below. Her heart leapt in her chest. There, standing just beyond the edge of the street lamp's glow, was a figure. A man. She couldn't make out his features, but she could feel his gaze, steady and unyielding. He was staring directly at her window, his eyes locked on hers. And then, just as suddenly as she saw him, he was gone, vanishing into the shadows. Emma's blood ran cold. She wasn't imagining this. Someone was watching her. The figure outside her window hadn't been a trick of the light. Emma was certain of it now. The man was real, and he was watching her, lurking in the shadows just outside her apartment. Her mind raced, her body frozen in place as she stared out into the night. The street was empty now, silent except for the faint hum of the streetlights. But she could still feel his presence, pressing in on her from the darkness. She backed away from the window, her heart thundering in her chest. Every instinct told her to run, to leave, but where could she go? This wasn't just about being scared of a stranger. It was about feeling trapped. Her sanctuary, her home, had become a place of fear. The walls were closing in, and the very air seemed to pulse with an oppressive energy. She had nowhere to hide. Her phone buzzed, breaking her out of her panic. Emma grabbed it with shaking hands, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she glanced at the screen. It was a text message from Sarah, her coworker. "Hey, I'm worried about you. Do you want to talk? Maybe stay at my place tonight? I can come get you." Emma hesitated. The offer was kind, but she couldn't bring herself to explain what had been happening. How could she tell someone about the strange man lurking outside her window, the note that had appeared on her doorstep, or the sensation of being watched every waking moment? Would Sarah believe her, or would she think Emma was losing her mind? She texted back, her fingers trembling as she typed. "Thanks, but I'm okay. I just need to get some rest." That was a lie. She wasn't okay. She was terrified. And deep down, she knew she couldn't face another night alone in that apartment. But what choice did she have? The night passed slowly, every creak and groan of the apartment sending Emma's heart into overdrive. She kept the lights on, the shadows in her apartment now more sinister than ever. Sleep eluded her, and every time she closed her eyes, the image of the man's face, his empty eyes, his cold stare, was burned into her mind. She didn't know who he was or why he was following her. But one thing was clear. He was getting closer. At dawn, after hours of tossing and turning, Emma finally managed to fall into a restless sleep. But her relief was short-lived. She awoke to the sound of her doorbell ringing, an insistent, almost frantic tone. She groggily looked at the clock, 7:45 a.m. Who could be at her door this early? She didn't have any visitors. Her stomach twisted with dread. She hesitated for a moment, too afraid to answer. But the ringing continued, each chime louder than the last. Finally, she mustered the courage to approach the door. Her hands shook as she peeked through the peephole. There was no one there. Her heart skipped a beat, and she immediately swung the door open, half expecting to find someone standing on the other side. But the hallway was empty, just the same as always. The only thing that greeted her was the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Emma stepped back inside, her mind racing. She slammed the door shut and locked it behind her. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just a random prank or a strange coincidence. Someone had been here. Someone had rung her doorbell and left without a trace. She checked the locks again, making sure they were secure. It was then that she noticed something odd. Her mail had been tampered with. Her letters, normally stacked neatly on the counter, were now scattered. The contents rifled through. Panic bubbled up inside her as she sifted through the disarray. There, among the papers, was another note. This one was different from the first. The handwriting was messy, hurried. "I can't stay away. You belong to me now." Emma's blood ran cold. She couldn't breathe. her hands trembling as she dropped the note. It felt as though the walls were closing in on her. The feeling of being watched was unbearable now, a constant pressure on her chest. She couldn't stay here anymore. She needed to leave. But where could she go? Who could she trust? The apartment that had once been her safe space now felt like a prison. The fear, the isolation, the creeping sense that she was being hunted, it all consumed her. She wasn't just paranoid anymore. This was real. Someone had been in her home. Someone knew her every move, every breath. Just then, her phone buzzed again, the message lighting up the screen. "I see you. You can't hide from me." The message was from an unknown number. Emma's heart stopped. She was being hunted. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. She wasn't alone. She wasn't safe. The final message glowed on Emma's phone, the words hanging there like a sentence she couldn't escape. "You can't hide from me." It was as if they were a warning, a cruel affirmation that whatever this was, whatever nightmare she had found herself in, was far from over. She had always prided herself on her independence, but now it felt as though her very existence was being torn apart by someone she couldn't even see. Her apartment, her supposed sanctuary, was now a place of dread. Her mind raced as she tried to come up with a plan, any plan. She grabbed her keys and purse, but when she reached for the door, her body froze. The feeling, the one she couldn't shake for days, was back, stronger than ever. Someone was outside. She could feel it. It was no longer just a feeling. It was palpable, thick, suffocating. She tiptoed to the peephole again and pressed her eye to it, her breath shallow and fast. The hallway outside was empty, but she wasn't fooled. This time, the silence was louder than ever. It was too quiet. Her heartbeat seemed to echo in the emptiness, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Emma opened the door slowly, making sure the chain was still in place. She peered out again. Nothing. But as she pulled back, she noticed something horrifying. The carpet near her door was disturbed, as if someone had been standing there, waiting. Her stomach turned, and she slammed the door shut. The lock clicked, but it didn't bring her any comfort. She felt a tightening in her chest, as though the very air had grown heavy with anticipation. Emma paced the apartment, frantic. Her mind ran wild with thoughts. Should she call the police? But who could she describe? Who could she tell them was after her? The haunting text messages, the figure outside the window, the notes left in her apartment. There were no answers, no leads, just a growing sense of dread. But then something strange happened. As she moved toward the kitchen, she noticed the mirror across the room. It wasn't a large mirror, but she'd never paid much attention to it. Now it seemed to call her, its surface almost unnaturally clear in the dim light. She stepped closer to it, her hands trembling, and as she stared at her reflection, her breath hitched. Behind her in the mirror stood a figure. It was there, just as clearly as she could see herself. Tall, thin, and cloaked in shadow. The figure didn't move, but its presence was undeniable. Emma's heart pounded in her ears, her throat tightening as she stumbled backward. She spun around quickly, but there was nothing. No one. Her pulse raced, a cold sweat coating her skin. She turned back to the mirror. The figure was gone. Suddenly, the phone in her hand buzzed again, shaking her out of the trance-like state she'd fallen into. The new message was simple, chilling in its bluntness. "I'm right behind you." Before she could react, a loud knock came at her door, followed by a voice she didn't recognize. "Emma?" It was a low, guttural voice, distorted by something between a whisper and a growl. "Open up." She couldn't breathe. Her legs gave way and she dropped to her knees. The knock echoed through the apartment like thunder, each sound vibrating her entire body. She gripped the edge of the couch to steady herself, her eyes darting to the door. There was no one there. But the voice, she could still hear it, faint but unmistakable. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse with terror. "Please go away." Her mind screamed for her to run, but her body was frozen. She couldn't move. The knocking continued, but now it had a rhythm, an almost mocking cadence. The voice outside was quiet, but it sounded closer than ever. Then she heard it again, the scrape of something against the floor, nails, claws, something dragging across the wood in a slow, deliberate pattern. It was coming from behind her, from the kitchen, from the hallway. Her skin crawled as she turned her head slowly, afraid of what she might see. And then she saw it. A shadow creeping along the walls of her apartment, slithering toward her. its form indistinguishable from the darkness itself. Her heart slammed in her chest as she bolted upright. But it was too late. The shadow reached out with a cold, bony hand and gripped her shoulder. Everything went black. When Emma awoke, she was lying in her bed, the light from the window filtering in through the blinds. The events of the night felt like a dream, a horrifying, twisted nightmare. She sat up, her body aching, but the silence of the apartment was almost deafening. Her phone lay on the nightstand. Hesitantly, she picked it up. The screen cracked and bloodied. She didn't remember dropping it. She didn't remember the cuts on her arms, the bruises on her legs. The final message had been waiting for her. It read simply, "You're mine now." And from that moment on, Emma knew. The nightmare wasn't over, it had only just begun.